Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to see you here. So many familiar names and so many unfamiliar ones. And I'm very happy that we gather here to discuss and to together make sense of the recent developments in the EU, Poland and Hungary. It was quite an eventful night yesterday and also the previous day regarding Hungary. My name is Anna Wójcik, and I'm delighted to chair today's extremely timely discussion. With us, we have our really distinguished speakers. First, I will introduce Karolina Borońska-Hryniewiecka, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Political Science and a lecturer at the Jean Monnet Chair of the University of Wrocław. Currently, she's also a fellow at the Centre Européen de Sociologie at the Sciences Politiques in Paris. She headed the EU program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs before. And with us, we also welcome Barbara Grabowska-Moroz, who is a research fellow at the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest and Reconstitution Program Fellow. She was a postdoc researcher in the famous Reconnect project that dealt with the rule of law. She also worked as a lawyer and project coordinator in the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights in Warsaw and as a legal expert in FRANET, a multidisciplinary research network of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. Daniel Hegedüs is a senior fellow and a senior program officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Berlin. He writes and speaks extensively on populism and on democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe and the European and foreign affairs of the Visegrad countries. He's frequently quoted in many national and international media outlets, and I'm certain that after this meeting he will be quoted in many of them again. Christophe Hillion, Professor Cristophe Hillion, is Professor of European Law at the University of Oslo, Research Professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and Senior Advisor at the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies in Stockholm, and also Academic Fellow at the European Policy Center in Brussels. He will be soon also a visiting professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and we are all very happy to have you with us very soon. So just to briefly recap the whirlwind events that happened in the past 2 days, I will make like a very short introduction. So yesterday it was announced that under the conditionality mechanism that was introduced 2 years ago, 6.3 billion euros will be suspended to Hungary. Initial proposal was 7.5 billion euros. However, to sweeten things up, the Hungarian post-pandemic recovery plan was finally accepted, and it's conditional on meeting the rule of law milestones. Yesterday, the Polish government has made a U-turn and negotiated new solutions regarding judiciary with the European Commission. Yesterday night, Justice Minister Ziobro survived yet another vote of no confidence in the Polish parliament. And in the early hours, a new project was presented that would introduce or may introduce new changes to judiciary in Poland again. Let's maybe start, because we initially planned it to also include like certain broader perspectives. So we are of course here to listen to the rule of law. But my first question is actually broader. It's a question to Karolina. What do you think of the current place of the rule of law in the European Union's agenda? What are actually the other great preoccupations of the Union, and how does it influence the whole debate of the rule of law?
Well, thank you very much, Anna. I hope that everybody can hear me well. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar, which is a very timely topic and very prominent guest, so I'm really privileged. I will maybe start by responding to your last question, so whether the rule of law is really on top of the agenda. Well, it is clear that the Russian aggression on Ukraine and the ongoing war have clearly reoriented EU priorities. And well, as much as we like it or not, the rule of law is in fact now less pressing than it was before. So while we have observed, as you mentioned, quite positive developments in the last few days with regard to upholding the rule of law by EU institutions, this issue, in my opinion, will not be on top of the EU agenda in the foreseeable future, in the foreseeable coming months. However, I believe that a certain change, of which you also asked, change of optics is taking place with regard to the rule of law. I think that this unprecedented decision of the Council of the European Union, well, at the COREPER level at the moment, but still it is to be confirmed by a Council official decision. And let's remember that Council is the most politicized institution with divergent strategic interests. So its decision to implement the conditionality mechanism with respect to Hungary and to suspend some part of the funds, I believe that this sets a new dynamics to the rule of law dispute. In what sense? Well, it confirmed for me the tangible economic interdependence dimension of the rule of law. And the conflict of rule of law. And also it confirmed the political will to give the conditionality mechanism a real teeth. And these two elements were lacking, as we know. So now it is also a test of intentions of both Hungary and Poland, because as we know, the money will not start to flow now. They will be flowing when the milestones will eventually be implemented. But going back to your question on the priorities that have been reshuffled, well, undoubtedly the top priority for EU institutions is now to support Ukraine and to help it win the war. And what is more important, this is a consensus across parties, across political lines, across member states. And we could see the proof of it several days ago when the Council has tried to circumvent a Hungarian veto on the 18 billion assistance package to Ukraine, right? So it tried to do that. It did that with success. It accepted that there is an eventuality of disbursing this money on the basis of individual guarantees, but ultimately Hungary lifted its veto. So it shows certain political consensus across the lines. Obviously, helping Ukraine involves also brokering and implementing further sanctions. And this will not be that easy because, as we know, there are many divergent interests involved. And we are now anticipating the approval of the 9th package. And this will be also priority of the Swedish incoming presidency. The second area of preoccupation, I believe it's EU security, but security in a very broad dimension, broadly understood. So here we're obviously talking about military security, but also cyber security, energy security, economic security, and what I would like to focus on quickly, the democratic security. There is an increasing evidence, and it comes from EU institutions. We hear it that there is more and more foreign state and non-state actors' influence and interference into the functioning of the EU, its democratic systems. I'm talking here about disinformation. I'm talking about hybrid strategies to influence our political societies, the way we perceive things, the way we frame things. So this is basically causing a lot of threats like divisions, like hate speech, like polarization, but also, as we could see over the last days with respect to the scandal in the European Parliament, there is a worrisome scale of foreign interference in the integrity of EU institutions, basically. So this is something that has to be addressed, and this will become surely top priority on the EU, the institutions agenda. And finally, the last priority, well, we cannot forget about the green transition, labeled as the Green Deal, and it's a very cross-sectoral issue. And if we look at even the next generation EU recovery plans, fair share of it, like 1/3 of all the investments are going to be sacrificed to the Green Deal, right? And this will be the priority for the EU. And we can see it even now, accepting the Repower EU initiative, etc., that this will be top priorities. These are existential threats. So the rule of law, yes, but not on top of the agenda.
Thank you very much. From the perspective of people who mostly write and read on the rule of law topics, that is, I would say, a big enlargement of at least my thinking. So, Christophe, But zooming into the actual EU policy regarding the rule of law this year. So in what ways has the war in Ukraine impacted this particular policy, in your opinion?
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's indeed, as Karolina said, it's a very timely moment to meet and discuss those issues. The impact of the war, well, as Karolina already alluded to, there was a fear at the outset in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. There was a fear at the outset that the EU and its member state would get even softer on the protection of the rule of law, and this fear has not completely dissipated. It's still there. The main concern at the time, and still is, was to maintain unity of member state at all costs, as unity is seen as essential to react to the Russian aggression, and as key to help Ukraine protect itself, if not win the war. And indeed, practically, institutionally speaking, unanimity indeed is required for the EU to adopt a whole range of measures to help Ukraine and to react to the Russian aggression, from sanctions to various instruments to support Ukraine. Various governments have understood this necessity of unity, and I've tried indeed, I'm talking here about the usual suspects, they've tried to gain concessions in exchange for their support to various EU measures to support Ukraine. I mean, we've seen on several occasions the Orbán government trying to gain several concessions in exchange for their support of some EU sanctions, and sometimes even succeeding in having the EU revisiting its sanctions against various personalities in Russia in this context. We have also seen certain member states becoming much more accommodating towards Hungary, but especially Poland. The view was that Poland has been so profoundly affected by the war, and given that the Polish government, according to some, got so engaged in welcoming refugees, that it was not the time to be too hard on the Polish government. And thus there was indeed an impression that the rule of law concerns would somewhat be relegated to lower priorities. But we see an evolution. As I said, those fears have not completely disappeared, but the decisions of the last few days indicate that the attitude of the EU and most member states is perhaps not as soft on the rule of law as one could have feared at the outset. As we heard about, the decision of the OKO.press is showing that EU member states are not ready to sacrifice everything in the name of unity. There is a resolve to act on certain issues, including on the rule of law, even if it is at the cost of unity. It was quite striking, and in my view, this is really a watershed. It was quite striking that 26 member states were ready to go ahead and support Ukraine, thus circumventing the obstruction of the Hungarian government and basically neutralizing its veto game. And so in my view, something is happening, and I would say that perhaps contrary to what we may have feared at the outset here, the war is perhaps helping to become a bit more active on the rule of law. Or should I say, it's perhaps the way in which certain governments, and the Hungarian government in particular, the way in which this government has reacted to the unfolding of the war may have convinced the other member state that it was perhaps time to address some of the development in that country. In this respect, I found it quite remarkable that the Polish government has been willing to side with the other member states in the adoption of the decision to suspend the fund towards Hungary. So, well, the jury is still out, still early days, but this decision, if it is confirmed today, would be a remarkable development, which indicates that the war in Ukraine might not be instrumentalized to get too soft on the rule of law, but quite the opposite. It might actually be a moment where it is time to address some of the fundamental problems of the EU, and that is the rule of law crisis. This is a happy development, given that when you think about it, the war has led to the EU's recognition that Ukraine, Moldova, and indeed Georgia now have the prospect of becoming member states of the Union. And if the EU is really serious about it, then it will have to become even more scrupulous in the defense of its own values, because if it is getting softer internally, it will have no authority to help Ukraine and the other candidate states, including those of the Western Balkans, to meet the standards. And that ultimately would be a wonderful victory for the Russian regime, which is quite adamant to undermine, if not destroy, the European Union. If the EU gets soft in the context of the war and in the preparation of Ukraine's and others' accession to the EU, on the very fundamentals that underpin its existence and functioning, then Putin will have achieved something which is not able to achieve in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it was not the first expectation in the early days of March that actually the rule of law will become a topic that even Poland, in respect to Hungary at least, wants to tackle. So let's move to Hungary. Today, I actually looked at the timeline of the Hungarian Justice Minister, Judith Varga, and she's quite jubilant. She's been promoting the 5 months of hard work and many accomplishments that she's made. Yes, I mean, it's a very nice PR operation, but indeed, Daniel, could you explain us what actually happened in the past 2 days? And does the Hungarian government have reasons to be happy? And why does it happen now?
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be part of such a stellar panel. Obviously, I think it's an understandable reaction that all political players try to save their faces. And what we see here is exactly from the part of the Hungarian government. But if you allow me, I would start from a broader perspective and just to bring some disagreement in the discussion. I think my reading on the impact of the war in Ukraine is just the opposite of Karolina's and Christophe's, which is that exactly the war in Ukraine created a political situation which first time in the history of the European integration allowed EU institutions and member states to effectively step up in the protection of the rule of law and put appropriate leverage on an autocratizing government. This couldn't happen without the war in Ukraine. This couldn't happen without the pro-Russian position of the Hungarian government, because without the political conflict between Hungary and its Central and Eastern European neighbors, first and foremost the other Visegrad countries, a situation that there is no Central European solidarity and the other Central European countries are not protecting Hungary in the country, simply couldn't take place and couldn't come to daylight. So we don't necessarily have to focus on the war in Ukraine. We have to focus on the different geopolitical embeddedness of the two countries under rule of law scrutiny, Poland and Hungary, which also explain how differently the rule of law related policies have played out over the past year in case of these two countries. But coming back to your question and Hungary, no, I think the Hungarian government has no reason to celebrate, even if they try to save face in the domestic arena. What happened on Monday is that practically the original Commission proposal, which was to put it in that way, a rather brave proposal from the perspective of the European Commission, was adopted with an overwhelming support in the Council after slight modifications. And of course, we can always discuss whether the glass is half full or half empty. And of course, figures matter. So I can just refer to the tweets of Professor Daniel Kahneman that, of course, it's only approximately 1/3 of the Hungarian cohesion allocations, and even less if we take the whole EU allocation into account and also the agricultural subventions. But still, it's 1/3 of the Hungarian cohesion allocations. And if we take a realistic look on the events of just the past week, it's obvious that the European Commission has shown a risk appetite never seen before, a rather committed approach never seen before, that they practically returned the original proposal without alteration for the Council after the Council requested alterations, and that happened within days. And I think first time happened that large member states really invested in majority and coalition building behind the rule of law issue in the Council, which together with the activities of the Czech Council presidency allowed this unanimous support. And if that's not a positive development in comparison to the past 12 years, then I think nothing is. The key conclusion is that 1 week ago, a strategic failure of the conditionality regulation was a realistic political scenario, that the first application will fail, and the lessons learned of the European Commission will be that don't touch that tool again, because it caused us a significant political defeat. And in comparison with that realistic scenario, what happened that it's a strategic success. The first application of the conditionality regulation was a success. And no one can in the European Union argue again that the tools are not appropriate and are not available. And this situation, I think, practically underlined that in the protection of the rule of law, politics matters. And I know that it's a really disappointing reading for lawyers, but on the other hand, I think it's a very important self-sobering conclusion, and very important because I think it urges us to shift perspectives. The rule of law protection cannot be advanced with figuring out even more creative theoretical legal solutions, which otherwise will never be implemented by any EU institution and will solely remain within the academic circles. But what is necessary is to make the political work, to gather political support behind the rule of law issues. And I am not stating that that innovative academic solutions are unimportant. They are very, very important because they shape the agenda and shape thinking. But we have to focus on the political work, because otherwise we won't have similar positive results in the future. And just rounding up, this is a defeat for Hungary. This is a defeat for Hungary because they lost nearly 13 billion euros. 6.3 is suspended. And I don't see any opportunity that can be released in the future, because there is a widespread perception that the Hungarian government is far from fulfilling that 17 conditions set in June by the European Commission. And obviously the Hungarian recovery plan was adopted. It was necessary. Otherwise, Hungary had lost 70% of that amount. But at least with regard to the recovery fund, Hungary will be in a similar situation to Poland. The plan is adopted, and financial transfers are not taking place and will not take place, because to that Hungary would need to fulfill 27 conditions. And it's impossible that they can fulfill it until March 31. So practically the can will kick down on the road. And I think what we have to be prepared for is that at the end of March, beginning of April, Hungary and Poland will be allies again, because both countries will face the situation that they would like to unlock the recovery fund payments, and they can improve each other's positions if they cooperate. So this time, obviously, Poland's agenda was determined by the 18 billion Ukraine aid. That won't be the situation in April, and we have to be prepared for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, that's both uplifting and depressing. So depressing in the short term for Hungary, and we can verify your claim on the Polish-Hungarian friendship in the spring. So moving to Poland, right now in Poland, we are very preoccupied with the fact that, yes, as Daniel mentioned, the milestones have been set, but they are not fulfilled, and now the government is grappling with it. Barbara, you are in a very difficult position because many things happened during the night, and we care about work-life balance, so no one expects you to, to fully comment on that. But in the broader picture, so what has happened so far with the milestones and what we can expect?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me well. When it comes to the milestones and the whole rule of law battle discussion in Poland, there are different layers. On the one hand, yes, we have this discussion with the Commission based on the so-called milestones, but there are also European Court of Justice judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. So elements of the rule of law problems is multi-layered. It's not just the milestones. Those have been set up in June, and they are being discussed since June with the Commission. The first reaction was amendments to the Supreme Court Act. So the infamous disciplinary chamber was abolished, and the new one was established. It just started working, so we have seen some decisions being made. Judge Igor Tuleja, who was suspended for almost or even more than 2 years, he could return to adjudicate cases. He's full judge. He has full opportunity to work again after 2 years, which was one of the milestone in the Commission. So Commission required that the judges who were affected by the disciplinary chamber, that they have access to effective remedy. The problem with this new chamber established by the Supreme Court is that it consists also of the unlawfully appointed judges by the National Council of Judiciary. And I think this is the key point of the whole discussion about the milestones. I think they are missing two basic elements, the very starting point of the whole crisis in Poland. They don't mention National Council of Judiciary, and they don't mention Constitutional Tribunal. So after the whole discussion with the Commission, even if the Commission accepts any kind of improvement when it comes to the Supreme Court or disciplinary chamber, it can change very quickly if we don't take care of those starting points of the whole crisis. And as you mentioned, Anna, yesterday, there was a news that some kind of deal was made with the Commission, between the Polish government and the Commission. And then we saw draft law again on the Supreme Court. Apparently, one disciplinary chamber is not enough. Let's establish a second one, but not in the Supreme Court, but in the administrative court. So apparently there are going to be two disciplinary chambers with similar powers, but not the same one. So apparently there are going to be two chambers, and administrative court, which is not tasked with dealing with fact-based cases. They're just dealing, with the legality of public administration decisions. They go into review disciplinary cases, which is really quite surprising, taking into account the whole structure of judiciary in Poland. It's just kind of like not very. I think, from my perspective, it's not a good idea. If you want to create a mess in judiciary, it's a perfect way to go, but I don't think it really solves any kind of real problem, and it does not solve the problem of established by law requirements. It still will consist of judges appointed by the National Council of the Judiciary. One of the milestone in this plan presented by the Commission is that the quality of the lawmaking is going to be improved. It's going to be transparent, it's going to be consulted, and the impact assessment will be provided to each and every draft. Here we have, a private bill draft submitted by the group of MPs. Of course, it was prepared by the government. Everyone knows that. I think it might have even got some kind of approval from the Commission. So no consultations have been made so far. There are no, the last day of the session of the Parliament is going to be tomorrow. I don't think it's possible to adopt this law by tomorrow, but it means it's going to be the high on the highest level on the agenda in January, if it turns out that the Commission gave the green light to accept this this proposal, and it seems that they agree on that. Meaning, we have now fresh press release saying that Commissioner Reynders kind of presented the draft, and it's supposed to be approved by the Commission without any formal decision so far. But it kind of like it was perceived as a good sign, a step in a good direction, despite the fact it does not solve any of the basic problems when it comes to the whole crisis. And still, the fines imposed by the European Court of Justice in October last year, they're still being paid by Poland, meaning they're being deducted from the funds kind of reserved for the Polish government, which basically shows nothing has changed. But somehow, and I'm kind of struck by that, somehow Commission is ready to go and make a deal with the Polish authorities, which might mean, I'm not a political scientist, but it might mean that maybe the Commission is just tired, or maybe they set up the milestones which would be possible for the government to meet on the very lowest possible level without touching the core issues, meaning tribunal, meaning Council of the Judiciary. So I think here we're trying to solve some of the issues of the rule of law agenda just to allow the transfer of the funds. Meanwhile, of course, we have this conflict within the government. No solutions so far, but also we have this kind of confrontations with Brussels, in the saying, like, deputy minister going to Brussels saying we're not gonna change anything in the Polish legal framework because we have fulfilled all the milestones, and then a month later, apparently a law needs to be amended. So I don't think this is the last element in this rule of law drama, and I think we're going to see more in January.
We can't wait. It's like a TV series with lots of seasons. So we've already have 7 in Poland. In Hungary, it's like a telenovela at the moment. Karolina, I was wondering, because we've been talking a lot about the rule of law as a politics question in addition to a legal question, and in the past days the EU has been rocked by the biggest corruption scandal in recent memory, right? So you are working a lot on democratic deficit of the Union. So during the discussions about any sanctions or penalties to Hungary and Poland, it was always mentioned that don't do that because then it will turn away societies in those countries from the EU, and the EU will be perceived as this awful and cold bureaucratic machine that at the moment cuts us money and is not crystal clear in itself. So what, in your opinion, will happen with the EU's face-saving mission at the moment?
Well, thank you for this question. And this is the sad, depressing part for me to address this lobbying related, or corruption maybe better to name it, scandal at the European Parliament. And this scandal surely will impact citizens' perception of the European Union, because surprise, surprise, national media across the member states largely cover it on a daily basis since the weekend. And as much as the media haven't spared much of their broadcasting time to report, for example, on the conference on the future of Europe that was taking place last year, and it has brought many qualitative positive changes to the European democracy, or to inform citizens about the follow-up of these consultations, they eagerly report on the scandals, and this is the nature of the media. But this is also very negative bias for the European Union, because it's affecting its democratic legitimacy, and the picture is clear. We get the message that members of European Parliament are corrupted, and obviously corruption erodes trust of European citizens, and European Parliament, who's supposed to act on their behalf, it's basically losing the battle of narratives. And the Eurosceptics are winning in this case. And let's remember that the European Parliament has been the protagonist in the rule of law dispute in the European Union. It was postulating the very strict sanctions on member states violating and democratic backsliding. As Daniel mentioned, the strong resolve of the European Commission not to back down from its original assessment of the situation in Hungary has been to a large extent a result of the pressure from the European Parliament as well. And why would the Commission care? Well, obviously the Commission needs European Parliament to implement its legislative program, which was postponed due to pandemics, due to the war as well, and it's the second part of its mandate. So you know that these are the trades-off. And now we can clearly see that with the scandal, the so-called Orbáns of the world are gloating on these events at the European Parliament, very spectacular events, because let's remind our participants that basically Vice President of the European Commission, one of the many vice presidents, she was arrested caught red-handed in possession of huge amounts of money, probably received as a bribe from third country Qatar. And there are many other prominent figures from the European Parliament, but also outside of it, from NGOs involved in that. So in other words, Orbáns are gloating that and implying that European Parliament doesn't have a moral mandate to preach others about the rule of law. And as much as this position is mistaken, in my opinion, because there is a huge difference between a system which is able to detect and swiftly prosecute such corruption activities, and a system as the Orbán's regime that legitimizes and petrifies corruption and treats it as a systemic trait. The European Parliament has a bitter lesson to learn, and maybe let's briefly have a look at it. This is a negative reminder for all of us, but we should be aware of it. So the truth is that the Qatar gate has exposed the weaknesses in the European Commission, European Parliament, basically EU institutions lobbying regulations, also the flawed ethics system of members of European Parliament, and to some degree also exposed certain political negligence. For example, one of the arrested persons in the Qatar investigation, Mr. Panzeri from Italy, he was a president of the Brussels-based NGO, paradoxically called Fight Impunity, which until recently also had very prominent members on its board from the left-wing European spectrum, like Federica Mogherini, like Emma Bonino. They resigned, obviously, but still this is a fact. And the crucial thing is here that this NGO was operating as an interest group lobbying in a just cause about human rights, but without being listed on the obligatory transparency register for lobbyists. So this is a violation of EU regulations, but more importantly, and I would like to now point to that particular circumstance, is that in 2021, the European Parliament, members of Parliament have actually refused to apply the so-called strict conditionality rule, which actually would force them to meet only with registered lobbyists. So in other words, they could meet with everybody. It depended only on their buona volonté. So this is basically something that has to be addressed now. And that's why this scandal to a large extent happened. And finally, it turns out that European Parliament Committee on Foreign Interference was also appealing to the hitherto president, David Sassoli, about the scale of foreign interference. It was already some time ago and it remained unaddressed. So to sum up, this scandal that takes place now is to a large extent a self-inflicted damage, and it has to be very swiftly and very resolutely addressed to be able to still, for the European Parliament to still play reliable rule of law defender, you know, in front of all of us, of European citizens.
Thank you. It was certainly a gift for Viktor Orbán. And Daniel, the question is actually, how are Hungarians reacting to this, and how is Orbán's propaganda presenting what is going on? And I wonder if actually this huge funding of a huge cut of funding would be the last straw that will finally convince the Hungarian voters that maybe this is not the best form of governance.
Thank you, and I will try to keep it concise that we have time for the Q&A. So just a couple of words. First, I completely agree with Karolina, and just would like to add that please mention me another national level corruption scandal in which high-level office holders are suspended from their position in 3 days. And then just compare the approach of the European Parliament to any similar national level scandals. And just as a message to Eurosceptics, as far as I know, similar investigations are going into bribing of UK parliamentarians, which was definitely not one of the heartland of Eurofederalism over the past couple of years, which also shows that it's not necessarily an EU-level corruption problem. But nevertheless, it's obvious that the Hungarian government propaganda makes attempts to exploit this current scandal. Both Prime Minister Orbán and high-level office holders, the State Secretary for International Communication, Zoltán Kovács, made certain communication moves which highlighted the corruption in the European Parliament, and, as you said, the lack of moral standards and high moral view to criticize corruption in Hungary. I don't think that it will be effective. And the reason is that they currently lack to find an appropriate pitch, how to address practically the bigger elephant in the room, which is to communicate the package deal, in which they backtracked from 2 positions which they used as blackmailing against the European Union, but which were more or less also communicated in the Hungarian public as principal positions. And that ultimately Hungary won't have an access to all of these EU funds. And they struggle with that. It's obvious in their communication, they will need time. And whether this will change anything in the Hungarian society and political support for the government, to be honest, and this will be a frank, I don't know. But I think it's even not necessarily important in short term, considering that the next elections in Hungary are scheduled for 2024, and that the opposition also doesn't appear to be capable to exploit the current weakness of the government. So I think it's much more important how this whole set of affairs will impact the Hungarian government position and their EU strategy. Because this is a watershed moment for the Hungarian government. They get bloody noses, and I think they are aware that they can get bloody noses again if they further proceed with this blackmailing and extortion-based EU policies. So the big question in the room is, what's next? They cannot make a U-turn and set their policies or build their policies on compliance. It's very difficult for a regime which was built 12 years long on the exploitation of EU funds and abuse of EU funds through strategic corruption, just to start to be transparent and and show high level of integrity. That will be suicidal from the perspective of the regime's elite. So I think in the next 2 months, we will be able to see and watch the developments in which direction things will continue. And again, certain aspects don't necessarily relate to the rule of law, but to geopolitics. We have to watch what will happen with the Hungarian blockade to the Swedish and Finnish NATO accession. The voting currently in the Hungarian parliament is scheduled to February. If they reschedule it to January, then of course this will be a message to partners that they will try to play a more constructive game and potentially will try to comply. If they again postpone it, this is a message that they are gathering ammunition for the next round of the battle, early April, when the European Commission has to assess the fulfillment of the 27 super milestones. So I think this is the crucial point, and this is the what to watch, because this will be decisive how and whether at all the Hungarian government try to readjust their policies in light of all of these new developments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. That is a very detailed analysis. Barbara, let's go back to Poland. And actually, you already mentioned that the milestones do not touch upon the key issues in the Polish rule of law problem, including the Constitutional Tribunal, but there are also others, such as the prosecution service. And what is your take on that? I mean, what actually the rule of law concerns of the EU should be in the coming year? I mean, even supposing that the milestones would be accepted and the money will flow to Poland and warm cold hearts of Polish voters. I'm clicking on you to unmute you. Okay, you can't be unmuted. Okay, we'll try to resolve it, and maybe.
Sorry, Barbara, can you try again? No. Could you join us again?
Yes, and meanwhile, we have a couple of minutes left, and let's move to a question regarding actually the EU milestones and the fact that in the European judges circles, they were not very well received, to say the least. So, dear Christophe, how do you feel about the case that was brought by 4 judicial associations to the EU Court of Justice regarding the milestones in Poland? And what do you think more broadly about the European institutions' approach to implementing the key judgments regarding of ECJ and ECTHR regarding judicial independence?
All right, does it work now? Yeah. I'm not going to spend much time on the pending procedure regarding the milestones. I'd rather say a few words about, as you're asking, on the development regarding the rule of law this year and the role that the EU has played. I've seen some positive developments, starting with, and this is not new, it's the contribution of the European Court of Justice is really in really affirming the key role that the EU and institutions have to play to safeguard, uphold the rule of law in the EU. I'm referring here in particular to the 2 decisions with respect to the legality of the conditionality regulation, in which the Court of Justice was quite clear in rebutting all the competence questions that have been aired for some time by the usual suspect, Poland, Hungary, with respect to the EU's ability to defend the rule of law and its other values. The language of the court was really quite powerful, and this may have been both a signal and indeed an incentive to the various protagonists, in particular the European Commission, to play its role more actively. And we may perhaps understand the recent development in the light of the signals that have been sent by the European Court of Justice. the other, of course, development is indeed what is happening as we speak, namely, finally, and Daniel was quite eloquent about this. I'm still not as positive as he is with respect to the decision, simply because we will have to see whether it's followed on coherently with respect to other member states, and there I still have a few doubts, but clearly when it comes to the positive development this year, the council decision that is being taken is certainly one of them, one of those that have to be welcome. I thought the council could have gone much further in many respects. I mean, if you compare what the three EEA EFTA states have done in relation to Hungary, they were much bolder. They have basically cut all the funds in the EEA financial mechanism towards Hungary in the period 2014 to 2021, which seemed to me sort of stronger message, or they're sending a stronger message than the council at the moment. Now, when it comes to the more concerning developments, I'll mention a couple, and that somehow respond or relates to one of the points that Daniel made a bit earlier. As Barbara underlined, not all the problems are solved with respect to Poland. We will see whether there will be a decision to suspend funds or to continue suspending funds in relation to Poland. But this decision in itself will not address many of the outstanding issues. And as a lawyer, one which I found particularly problematic is that decisions of the European Court of Justice and of the European Court of Human Rights are simply not followed. Poland does not even pay some of the fines which have been imposed by the European Court of Justice. And I found that fundamentally problematic, even if the conditionality regulation may help us get somewhere in terms of putting pressure on the backsliding member states to change course. I'm not sure that in itself will be sufficient to restore the rule of law in the way we would expect it. And I'm not talking only in terms of principles here. As a lawyer, a believer in the rule of law, namely that conditionality regulation and the financial trick might help us. I think that the financial mechanism will only get us to a point, but not necessarily help us really resolving the fundamental problem, which is that we have two member states who are not ready to live with the fundamental requirements of membership. And even if we suspend all the money, what then if they don't change course? How do we address this situation? So I think the financial mechanism might be helpful in the short term, but in the medium and long term, the problem will remain if those governments are not changing course. And so given that the mechanisms we otherwise have in the system, from the infringement procedure, the possibility to impose financial sanctions on prevaricating member states, let alone Article 7, the fact that these mechanisms simply do not have the required impact in terms of changing the very conduct of some member state means that we are still in a very problematic situation. And I will finish by saying that this is not an internal problem. This is not a problem that only concerns us, we EU citizens, member states, and EU institutions. There is an increasing concern externally about how the EU is developing with respect to the rule of law and with respect to the values which it still actively and rightly professes on the international scene. I will just finish by quoting an excerpt of a decision of the Norwegian Supreme Court that came out last year. And I will definitely put that in the list of really concerning developments with respect to the protection of the rule of law in the EU this year. The Norwegian Supreme Court said that the systematic and general shortcomings of the Polish judiciary are so extensive and pervasive that there is relatively little by way of circumstances before an arrest warrant must be rejected. What this means is that the EU's trustworthiness as a constitutional order based on the rule of law, involving an integrated judicial system relying on member state court, that very system is losing its credibility, it's losing its trustworthiness. And this will have a major impact on the way in which the EU can present itself on the international plane, not only in terms of reputation, but in terms of its ability to entertain legal relations with third states and international organizations. It means that the rest of the world is starting to look at the EU as not the kind of international actor they would like to do business with. And I found that profoundly worrying. And even if the financial regulation can help us, again, in the short term, fixing or giving us a good impression that something is happening on the ground with some member state, I don't think it will solve this kind of reputation damage that is really becoming even more apparent in relation to the rest of the world. At a moment where the EU somehow remains a bastion of sanity in international politics. So at the time, the values in which we believe are being battered on the international stage, it's really high time that we get our acts together. And I think it will take more than simply suspending certain funds to Hungary and Poland.
Thank you so much. We have received already some questions, and I will just ask the first question from Ben Novak in Washington, who woke up at 4:45 a.m. to hear this great panel speak. So you have like a very committed audience here. And the question is to Daniel on the Commission's mini milestones and Hungary's ongoing commitment to meet them. This negotiation has largely been wrapped in a veil of secrecy, which seems to run against the expectation that Hungarian legislating involve a robust social consultation. What, if at all, would you recommend treating this dilemma? And I also encourage everyone who wants to ask a question to write it in the chat or raise your hand.
Thank you, Benj, and thank you for being with us. I think it's a very puzzling question. And I think we cannot straightforwardly state that the European Commission hasn't taken into considerations input from the Hungarian civil society. Because if we take a look on the 17 milestones, I wouldn't call them mini milestones, but I fully agree with all of the speakers that, of course, the threshold could be set higher in any of the cases when the European Commission is negotiating with Hungary or Poland. But these milestones are in part built on the annual rule of law review cycle reports, especially when it comes to the deficiencies of the Hungarian prosecutor's office, its lack of independence and negligence to address issues of strategic corruption related to Hungarian political circles. But of course, more transparency and more civil society involvement is always welcome. However, I think in that case, how the European Commission is negotiating with member states behind closed doors is not necessarily different from the mainstream approach of the European Commission. And if a system is consent and agreement-based, then I think negotiations behind closed door is simply the main tool which are used to achieve that agreements. And this is simply a feature of the European Union. I know that from a rule of law perspective and from the perspective of democratic participation, it appears to be a kind of bug, but I don't think that we can address this feature / deficiency in short term in any form. And against that background, of course, if, for example, in March, April, Hungarian civil society can contribute in a more active and more transparent way in the assessment of the European Commission about the fulfillment of the 27 super milestones, obviously it would be welcome. But I think from a political perspective, the main and crucial issue is that the Commission remains objective. And of course, it's again a political question. I think we have seen that the Commission can be committed when, for example, practically repeated the same proposal twice in a week, but it was because it felt certain political support. And again, in a very cynical way, I would emphasize that the objectivity and commitment of the European Commission strongly depends from the political support it receives from the member states and the political pressure and political leverage of the European Parliament exerted over the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, I don't see any more questions, which is a little bit surprising to me. Although, oh yes, there is a question from Jakob Levander to everyone. Enlargement and rule of law can be seen as part of the medium-term solution. What are your thoughts on involving candidate countries in the EU Justice Scoreboard, European Semester, etc.? Theoretically, this seems reasonable, but could this also backfire? So I would say that this may be a question first to Cristophe Hillion, who is like a very big expert on enlargement and the rule of law. What do you think?
Thanks, Jakob, for this question. And I'm not quite sure I understand the first statement, that enlargement and rule of law can be seen as part of the medium-term solution. Solution to what? To the rule of law crisis. As to the second part, the involvement of the candidate countries is, well, they are already involved insofar as the Commission already monitors developments in the candidate states that partly relate to the questions that are, or topics that are covered by the EU Justice Scoreboard. For instance, the state of the judiciary is definitely monitored by the European Commission in connection with one of the negotiation chapters. I think it's chapter 23 of the accession negotiation. So I think what you're referring here to is something that is partly the situation already, namely that the Commission already monitors the development in the candidate states as regards both the state of their judiciary as well as their economic policies, which could be linked to the European semester. So I think this is not only theoretical, this is already the case in practice.
Thank you. Okay, another question from Radek Mocke. Suspending Hungary's funds will not on its own restore democracy and the rule of law. Is there a long-term strategy how to do it? Suspend more and more money in order to starve the autocratic regime to death? Are other forms of intervention possible? Okay, that's a broad question. I remember that the quote from starving Poles to death is attributed to one of the German MPs and is frequently used in the Polish propaganda. So what
can I just intervene very briefly on this one? I mean, that there are essentially two ways to approach the rule of law problem. Either the EU institutions try to restore the rule of law at the level of member state, or they protect the EU constitutional order from the implications of the rule of law violation. I think there are limits to what the EU institutions and other member states can do with respect to the first approach, but there are duties of the EU institutions and other member states to protect the integrity of the EU constitutional order. So the implications of that is that perhaps rather than attempting desperately to change the situation on the ground, the approach ought to be fundamentally that of protecting the EU constitutional order, and that means both protecting its financial interest, hence the decision that we are just having at the moment. This is not a decision primarily targeted at Hungary in terms of asking it to change its way of operating. I see that fundamentally as the protection of the financial interest of the Union. That's what the conditionality regulation is for. Similarly, there is now an attempt to isolate a member state which becomes too obstructive in the decision-making process. And we've seen that last week, the ability of the other member state to say, well, you don't want us, or you don't want to be part of a particular decision-making process. And of course, we need unanimity, but we can do it without you. So the ability to circumvent the abuse of veto rights and the isolation of problematic member state is also a way to protect the EU constitutional order, paradoxically, by preserving the ability of the other member states to carry on with policy making. So I see this second track slightly more promising than the first one. The first one ultimately depends on what people on the ground want. I mean, as long as Hungarians are not willing and able to kick out Orbán from power, it's very difficult and slippery for the EU and its other member states to interfere. They can do certain things, they can support civil society, etc., etc. But I mean, the EU institutions and the other member states are not in the business of regime change inside the European Union. But what they can and should do is definitely protecting the general interest of the EU, the integrity of its constitutional order, and that includes the way in which the money is spent, the way in which decisions are taken, so as to protect the 26 or 25 other democracies which have common interests and want to adopt particular measures to fulfill these interests.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the final word to Barbara, whom we can finally hear.
Yes, I hope.
Wrap up.
Great. Since I finally can unmute myself, I just want to follow up on Christophe's comment regarding the limits of the EU possible actions in future. What the EU cannot do, you cannot change power at the domestic level. It's just undoable, impossible. Despite the propaganda presented by Warsaw or Hungary. So the issue of transition or issue of accountability is something that has to be secured at the domestic level. And when it comes, I want to combine a little bit with the question you asked me like 15 minutes ago. I think right now the main political actors, meaning political parties, either in Hungary nor in Poland, they don't present such kind of program for future. I know it was debated in Hungary before last elections, how to return to rule of law in Hungary, but I don't see such scenario right now in Poland when it comes, to tribunal, to Council of Judiciary, all the institutional surroundings. So I think this is the basic thing to do before the next elections. However, the elections in Poland will not be about the rule of law. They will be about inflation, maybe about war. So the question is how to return the rule of law as a main topic to agenda at the domestic level.